But we're going to find out what the political classes may well do. As we said earlier on, we've got an election next year, and the various political parties in Scotland were invited to join us here this morning. The Scottish Conservatives declined the invitation to join us. The Scottish Liberal Democrats couldn't provide us with a spokesperson, but I'm delighted to say that representing the Scottish Government today, we have the Minister for Public Finance, Ivan McKee, MSP, and if Ivan wants to come up and take his seat. We've got the new co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Ross Greer, MSP. Your programme says Martin Whitfield, MSP for Scottish Labour. Martin, unfortunately, has had to pull out, but I'm delighted to say that we've got the Central Scotland Labour MSP, Mark Griffin, who also leads for Labour on housing issues in the Scottish Parliament. And also particularly warm welcome to Andy McKeever, who's a former head of comms for the Scottish Conservatives. Now, Andy is not here to speak on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives today, but I think that he's a trenchant political analyst, also a podcaster as well with Holyrood Sources. So if Andy would like to come up and share his perspective with us. You should all have a question for the panel. And we're going to go around these questions, but I would like to start and perhaps just picking up on the point that Ruth made in her contribution, that one of the themes today has been that of council tax. So the first question that I would like to ask, and I'm going to pose it directly to Ivan and to Mark, are you going to abolish the council tax? And if you're not going to abolish the council tax, will you make it fairer by having a revaluation? Now, those are the two questions. What we don't want is a background commentary on the council tax or a background commentary which is going to take us off the questions. The two questions are you going to abolish council tax? And if you're not, when are you going to revalue? Ivan.
Well, you need to work out what you're going to replace it with, and that work we are talking extensively with COSLA and other partners, and what we've been very clear about is there needs to be consensus on this. So we are very keen to move forward to make changes to the council tax to make it more proportionate and to go forward with the valuation. But what's really important is that there is consensus on this, and that's what we're working to secure.
Okay, so you're not going to abolish it?
We are going to make changes to the council tax based on the consensus that we're building. There needs to be consensus on this.
And is there going to be a revaluation?
Again, there needs to be a consensus on taking that forward.
Well, we already know there won't be a revaluation because the First Minister's already told us there won't be a revaluation.
Well, we've said that we're working to get that consensus. The reality is that one party on their own aren't going to be able to take this forward. It's too much of a...
You've had 18 years.
Well, that's the whole point, that's what I'm saying. This needs to be a consensus across the political spectrum. And it's not just saying we don't like the council tax, it's what you're going to replace it with. That's what's important. Is it going to be revenue neutral, what you're going to replace it with? Is it going to be truly proportionate? Is it going to be proportionate based on within local authorities or a nationwide system? How's the rebate scheme within that going to work? Those are all the issues that need to be thrashed out to understand what you're going to replace it with.
Let me give you a prediction, Ivan.
You can't just say, I'm going to get rid of it without knowing what you're going to replace it with.
Let me give you a prediction. The council tax will still be with us, not at the election next year, but the election after that.
I said it needs a consensus to move forward. I'm very clear about that.
So if there's no consensus, you don't move forward?
There needs to be a consensus. Yeah.
Right, so that's clear. So you're not going to abolish the council tax. You're not going to have a revaluation of the 1991 properties. You will change if there is a consensus, and if there's no consensus, you won't change.
One party can't do that on their own. There needs to be a consensus.
Right, same two questions
to... Not least because it's a parliament of minorities.
Okay, same two questions to Mark Griffin.
I think I would agree with Ivan on one point, that we will need political consensus, purely because of the polling at the moment points to almost a 2003 style rainbow parliament. You know, I do think there has been almost 20 squandered years where the Scottish Government have had a majority or near majority to be able to
Okay, let me rephrase the question. If there's a Labour majority after the election next May, will you abolish the council tax?
We have early work in the manifesto to reform the council tax. We haven't gone as far as saying an outright abolition.
And will that reform include a revaluation?
I think there is building consensus towards revaluation. You know, on the backbenches, local government committee, which contains members of all political parties in the Parliament, agreed that there should be a revaluation of the council tax system. I don't think the the front benches of the political parties are quite caught up with that. We've got a fairly wide-ranging consultation process that involves the entirety of the Labour movement when it comes to developing our policy. One of the options that we'll be discussing in Stirling at the end of this month will be that particular issue on revaluation.
Okay, well, let me give you a prediction that if you're in government, and I'll give you the same prediction that I gave Ivan McKee, the council tax in its current form will be with us, not at the next election, but at the election after that, because if you guys attempt to do anything in terms of revaluation, you can kiss goodbye to East Renfrewshire, East Lothian and Eastern Bartonshire, because the principle that actually unites you is one of maintaining your electoral base, not what is doing what is right.
I think if there's a Labour majority, then there will be reform of the council tax. That was your question. If there's a Labour majority, there will be reform of the council tax. I do think it's wildly unfair that council tax values are based on values at a point in time where I was at primary school. I do think we should learn lessons from what's going on in Wales. Wales are taking forward a revaluation programme and crucially building in a continuous revaluation. I think we should absolutely look at what they're doing and learn the lessons from them. But that whole reform of the council tax will have to include issues like revaluation.
Ross, I'm going to come to you, but just before I do, because you're going to give a very different perspective in all of this altogether. Andy, give me a sort of political commentary on why we get into this position, because I have covered this story time and time and time again, and politicians make noises that they accept that it's unfair, that they want to do something about it, they don't do anything about it, and I'm suggesting to them that they don't do it for electoral reasons and because there are pinch points within the system in parts of the country where they will lose seats if they do what they believe deep down to be politically correct, but might not be electorally advantageous.
Kemi Badenoch yesterday morning, I think, actually got asked if she would abolish the triple lock. And she immediately said, no, the triple lock on pensions. No, before the interviewer even really finished the sentence. No. She just talked about all the inequalities that existed and so on. No, not abolishing the triple lock. The answer to your question is the same answer to that question. Ultimately, the people who vote are the people who will lose. And that's why the parties don't do this. However, I have to say, not just on this issue, but on lots and lots of issues, I think that the political class in general does not give enough credit to voters. I think if you explained and articulated a position on this, I can understand I'm not a politician, so it's incredibly easy for me to say what I want. I understand why it's difficult, and in some seats, in some particular areas, it might skew a result. But overall, I think people are ready to give politicians a bit more credit for being straight on these things. For what it's worth, not that I have any skin in the game because I'm not in a position of authority, I would scrap council tax right now. I think it's a hopeless tax, but I wouldn't replace it with an alternative centralised tax. I would actually give the authority over it to local authorities, all of it, because part of the problem with council tax, some of the problems have been outlined, and I think they were correct, but part of the problem with council tax is it's too blunt. There are some local authorities that would benefit from, a wealth tax, some would benefit from a land tax, some would still benefit from property tax, some might benefit from income tax, most would benefit from a mix of taxes, but I think local authorities should have the power to do what they want to do and fill the hole that would be left by council tax revenues with something local. So I do agree with part of it, but I don't think the debate should be about replacing it with another centralised tax.
Ross.
So I actually very much agree with what Andy's just said. We should start off from an understanding that Scotland is an absolute weirdo by European standards in that we're talking about local taxation to fund local government and it is decided nationally. Councils have almost no control. So council tax, for a start, makes up less than 20% of councils' budgets, and even then it's the primary form of local taxation, but they have next to no control over it. So in principle I agree with Andy that councils should have far more fiscal autonomy. On this question though of how do we replace the council tax, I think the insistence on a consensus is a fantastic way to justify just not acting on this, because there's not going to be a consensus. The Tories are never going to sign up for this. Next session, Reform are absolutely not going to sign up to this. So setting the consensus as the benchmark for making progress is just a way of obfuscating around the fact that you don't intend on making any progress. So for a start, there should be, and on paper there is, a majority in Parliament right now. So we're talking about manifesto commitments for the next election. In the last few weeks, I tabled multiple votes in Parliament on a council tax revaluation, because regardless of whether you want to scrap it, tweak it, update it, whatever, if we're talking about a form of property tax, then we need up-to-date property valuations. I thought surely we can all agree on just having a good data set from which to then move to the next stage of this debate. And to their credit, the Liberal Democrats agreed. Everyone else voted against that. And some of my colleagues in other parties were quite open and honest about it. One particular colleague said, you know, this, it's absolutely ridiculous, it's nonsense. Ross, you weren't born in 1991, correct? But this is awfully difficult, and we should really leave this to the incoming Parliament after May. But yeah, we said that in the last session, and the session before that, and the session before that. We've been saying that since 1999. So I put forward proposals to do a one-off valuation that wouldn't even be binding. We wouldn't automatically apply it. I put in one-off, but it would be binding, that we lock ourselves into 5-year cycles of this, all sorts of options. And colleagues from other parties just didn't take it up. And I want to talk about like where the political difficulties are on this, because to their credit, the SNP were willing to move with us when we were in government together on some changes to the current system. So essentially changing the factor, the multiplier, so that band E and above would see some increases in their tax. Unfortunately, that coincided, the consultation on that coincided with the Rutherglen by-election. So, and I'm sorry, Mark, Labour put a leaflet out to every household in Rutherglen talking about a 25% rise in your council tax. The only people who were going to get a 25% rise were in Band H houses, and there's about 12 of those in the Rutherglen constituency. But that nuked it. The SNP overwhelmingly lost the Rutherglen by-election, and within a week, Humza Yousaf had announced that that proposal wasn't being taken forward. So even these small steps, that was still, it was marginally improving what is a fundamentally broken system, what was supposed to be a quick and dirty replacement for the poll tax in the early 90s, and now we were talking about making a small tweak that would have made it a bit less unfair, and it got nuked by the political reality of that by-election and of the proposal being absolutely misrepresented.
Okay, let's go round the tables, because you've all been cogitating away. Anne there, if you want to raise your point.
Would full fiscal devolution to Scotland be an option for Westminster if it made Scottish independence less urgent?
Okay, can we, that's quite a big one. I didn't think we were going to go onto the Constitution today. I'm going to go to a conference and not having to talk about independence or Devo Max or fiscal autonomy. Ivan, full fiscal devolution, I'm assuming that what Anne means is that every tax which is raised in Scotland stays in Scotland, and then the Holyrood Parliament would send a cheque to Westminster for issues like foreign affairs and defence, and maybe aspects of macroeconomic policy. You could call it Devo Max. Would that issue, and it's partly political and partly constitutional, but would that make tax justice easier to do?
Yes, and we want to talk about this. A lot of the things that have been talked about in the session I had earlier take us very quickly into reserve space, so what we can actually do is quite limited. So the answer to that, short answer to that is yes. Would it make independence more likely? I can't remember, who was it that said that devolution would kill independence stone dead? There you go. I think it's in that vein. I think every step we take towards more power in Scotland makes independence more likely, not less likely. And as far as we're concerned, the more of those taxpayers that come to Scotland, the better.
Andy, shouldn't the Scottish Conservatives actually support full fiscal autonomy? Because one of the Conservative arguments is that you need to be fiscally responsible. And it's easier to be fiscally responsible if you actually have more control over more taxes.
Well, so philosophically, the Conservatives should be the party of economic liberalism in Scotland. The problem is when that collides with constitutionalism, philosophy goes out the window and the Constitution takes over. So the answer to that is, of course they should. It would be completely logical. And in fact, if you want to put forward a position of easy or lower taxes and reap the benefits of that is basically impossible under the current fiscal framework. You can't really do it. So you do actually need to be able to raise what you spend. It's not dissimilar to the argument I just made about local authorities, incidentally. Actually, it's all layers of government, in my view, should be raising what they spend. And it would make, whether you wanted to put tax up or lower tax, and whatever argument you wanted to make around those things, it would be a much more credible argument if the Scottish Parliament was raising what it spent. The chances of the Scottish Conservative Party advocating that would be less than zero, I would say, because they will see that as butting up against their unionist position. I think incorrectly, but that's the reality of it, yeah.
Mark, isn't this, I'm going to put you, an attractive proposition for a Labour government, an attractive proposition, frankly, for any Westminster government, because if you have a situation of full fiscal autonomy, the Scottish Government cannot continue to deploy arguments about this is more Westminster austerity, because they would be responsible for all of these taxes, but it would still be within the constitutional framework of the United Kingdom. So shouldn't you just give it to them?
I mean, I can understand your argument that it might be politically expedient. But morally, I would say absolutely not. I think the question was, is tax justice more achievable if we had full fiscal autonomy? I think the level of cuts that we would have to impose in Scotland if we had full fiscal autonomy would make it almost impossible to achieve that tax justice. There's a real, a lot of the reasons why the decisions on tax or reform of council tax are so unpopular, because people look out their door and they see their services crumbling. You have to have both sides of the argument. You have to really demonstrate leadership in improving public services to then enable you to make those arguments on tax justice. But on full fiscal autonomy, I think that would see an absolute slashing of public spending in Scotland, and so we would not be in a place to be able to make the changes that we would want to make on tax justice.
Ross?
I believe, certainly the Greens believe in more fiscal autonomy for Scotland. Obviously, we believe in the ultimate destination of independence. There are challenges that come with full fiscal autonomy, though, because we would still exist with monetary policy being set at a UK level, with policies like immigration being set at a UK level, and those are key economic drivers. So having fiscal autonomy without these other levers is quite difficult to manage. That being said, we should have far more fiscal autonomy than we do now. Because part of the challenge over the period of devolution has been that we've, in Scotland, I think, ducked a lot of the difficult decisions around the economy, because the Scottish Parliament and government have largely been responsible for service delivery rather than management of the economy. We've got more tax power now, and the debate is shifting, and I think the debate is improving dramatically, the quality of it. But we're still at a point where, as has been talked about this morning, there is either going to be really, really significant tax rises or absolutely devastating cuts to public services in the next session of Parliament. There's no alternative. The Scottish Government is not allowed to run a deficit. It has less in the way of borrowing powers than local councils do. So something's got to give. Either we admit that there needs to be a huge redistribution of wealth, major tax reform, or the level of services currently being provided can no longer be provided. And the level of services we're currently providing are maintaining a level of child poverty that is about 1 in 5 children, that are failing to meet our climate targets, that are failing to meet nature and biodiversity targets, etc., etc. The only other point I'd make on this is a little bit of a challenge to the room is, when we're talking about fiscal autonomy and proposals for this Parliament and government to use more of its tax raising powers, it is so important that the proposals put forward to the Parliament and government are credible. So I agree with Faiza's point earlier about not getting into technicalities and caveats in the public debate, but I would say to colleagues in this room, of whom I am absolutely a fellow traveller on this debate, when you come in front of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament and demand that we do something that is reserved, it robs you of credibility, and it makes my argument much, much harder to win within the committee and within the Parliament. So it's really important for rooms of people like this, for us to be focusing on what are the serious, credible and deliverable ways that we can do radical wealth redistribution in Scotland.
Let's go to this table over here.
Yeah, so wanted to come in because our question kind of then builds on some of that point around autonomy, which is thinking of the challenge of tax justice in Scotland. Effectively, what is the point of tax devolution in particular in Scotland if the assumption is always made that whatever the UK government is doing is the default, and whatever Scotland is doing is some kind of aberrant deviation from that has to be justified? I mean, how do we progress tax justice when that kind of is the narrative? And I suppose, how do we challenge that narrative and sort of start talking about things, I suppose, almost from a Scotland Scotland-centric position rather than, well, why are you different from what the UK government are doing?
Mark, do you want to take that one on?
I think deviation from what's happening at a UK level is absolutely essential with the way the tax system's set up at the moment. You know, the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government benefit from getting greater revenues if we outperform the UK. So by its very nature, we have to diverge from what's happening at a UK level on economic policy. If we can increase wages, we increase tax take, we get additional powers, additional money for the Scottish Government budget. That's the way the fiscal framework is currently set up at the moment. So for me, you know, divergence isn't bad. Divergence is absolutely essential to plug in those deficits that Ross talked about, that we grow the tax base, that we are driving people out of poverty and in-work poverty that we heard about earlier, and that divergence has to be fronted up, led by a Scottish Government, and it's essential. It's not anything that should be frowned upon.
Ivan, there's divergence in a whole series of public policy positions, from tuition fees to free personal care, to prescriptions, to bus passes for under 22-year-olds and all the rest of it. I mean, is the issue of tax justice is whether or not these things which are done differently in Scotland, which come with a huge price tag. I mean, free personal care, Stuart Sutherland report, when it first came out, the price tag was £140 million. It's now much more than that. The issue surely is that you can diverge, but when you're diverging, are you always diverging in a way that the resources go to the citizens who need it most?
Well, I mean, that's a policy decision you make on a case-by-case basis, and thanks for listing everything there, Bernard. It saves me from doing that. Add in the Scottish Child Payment to that, and there are many others. The benefit spend in Scotland is, I think, now more than £1 billion higher than the equivalent spend if that was been run from the UK, because of extra benefits we've added in, like the Scottish Child Payment. And of course the tax take in Scotland is, I think, now £1.7 billion higher than it would have been if we'd followed UK government policies and tax. So in terms of that shift of taxing more for those who can afford it, and shifting that to help the kind of people that we heard earlier that Star and other great organisations I see in my constituency and elsewhere are supporting, we're already to the tune of more than £1 billion a year in that space. And of course the whole point of devolution is for there to be divergence. Now there are some areas where you need to look at that and understand behavioural issues, which does put a limit on some of the things you can do, because people have got options, and that needs to be factored in to the decisions you make. But absolutely, devolution, the whole point is to make those different decisions, and we have made significant progress, I would say, in that space, but absolutely we recognise there's more to do.
Ross, deal with the point about divergence, but also sort of deal, I mean, the point that I'm making about, in a sense, all governments are in the management of how they spend finite resources. And the Auditor General, and you can go all the way back in reports about spending decisions of the current Scottish Government, and how local authorities in particular have had successive settlements which make it really difficult for the kind of job that Heather Kay does, which we were hearing about there. And at the end of the day, councillors provide services, MSPs don't. They pass laws and they divvy up money. Councillors are right on the front line with this. And is there a sense in which, again, spending priorities which have meant that the squeezing of the local authority budgets in particular has been a bad thing for the very poorest citizens?
So, in part, it goes back to the point I was making a moment ago. For most of the period of devolution so far, we've not had a great deal of tax devolution, so the Parliament and the Government were just about service delivery, which means you conduct difficult decisions. We're less in that space now, but as a result of, I think, brave and correct decisions that we've made, that Ivan's just listed, you know, we spend, quote unquote, we overspend to the tune of more than £1 billion on social security in Scotland compared to what we get in the block grant. That does mean that this is the only part of the UK where child poverty is falling. It's still outrageously high, but we are going in a different direction. We should be proud of that, but we should also acknowledge that because of it, we've dug a really deep hole for ourselves that we need to get out of. But the fiscal framework that Mark mentioned is a massive inhibitor here, because Scotland does well out of it when we outperform the rest of the UK, but the rest of the UK includes London and the South East. So a situation in which Scotland is outperforming London and the South East on wage growth is highly unlikely and very rare. So the fiscal framework is structurally advantaged to the UK government. It's something that the Treasury won the negotiations on there. Because there's also the context of, like I was saying before, if we don't have control over things like immigration, of monetary policy, etc., how are we going to design an economy in Scotland that is outperforming London and the South East? The example I use of how broken it is that if there's flooding in Somerset, the UK government will step in, they'll spend money on flood relief to help people with damaged homes. The Scottish government will get consequentials from that. If it floods in Stonehaven, the UK government will not step in. They will say that that's for the Scottish government to deal with. There'll be no consequentials, and the Scottish government has to deal with that from a fixed budget that's already been allocated to something else. So something needs cut every time it floods in Stonehaven. But if it floods in Somerset, the Scottish government will actually benefit from that financially. Like, that's how broken the fiscal framework is. So yes, we need to be braver and we need to do more at our level, and you need to keep the pressure up on us. But there is also a fundamental challenge here of the system is ultimately designed by the UK Treasury. It's designed to favour the UK Treasury. That's not working for us either. One of the most obvious examples, and something that people in this room will be all too familiar with, is annual budget settlements rather than multi-year budget settlements. So councils and the third sector quite rightly want multi-year funding from the Scottish Government. But the Scottish Government doesn't get a multi-year settlement from the UK Government. So how can it make multi-year commitments? That, in and of itself, regardless of any ideological decisions around tax policy, wealth redistribution, if we just had 3-year budget settlements rather than annual ones, that would be absolutely transformational, because a lot of you wouldn't have to spend a third of your year doing grant applications, and that money could go into service delivery instead.
Andy, the point about divergence is one which was well made, but in a sense, it was almost set up to diverge in public policy terms. At some point, if there was no divergence at all, you would say, why would we be having the Parliament in the first place? But in terms of where public policy has diverged on these so-called things which are described as free, and of course they're not free because they're delivered by taxpayers' money. The last time I looked, where public policy had diverged in Scotland in comparison to England, these were costing now about $2 billion a year. Let me be sort of slightly provocative. Has devolution been quite good for endowing the middle classes with free things at the expense of the poor?
Well, so the first part of that is definitely true. So I mean, I'm not a fan of universal benefits. I just recoil against the thought of middle-class, wealthy people being given a bus pass for really no reason whatsoever. The old arguments that were made in favour of universal benefits about it being too expensive to extrapolate and all that sort of thing are largely redundant in a digital age now. And I think we are morally compelled to look again at some of these, because we are paying rich people to do things that they could pay for themselves, and I don't like it. I understand not everybody would agree, but that's my view on that. I think the problem with divergence is that when you have a little bit of extra power, it makes the job of Ivan and his colleagues extraordinarily difficult, actually, to be honest. They're basically just tinkering. It's just a permanent tinkering all the time. In a sense, you'd be better either having, and I believe in fiscal autonomy, so I mean, I think this is what it should be. You'd better either having a proper amount of powers to actually, in the round, I mean, we really only have income tax, for instance. We don't have VAT, we don't have corporation tax. There's a whole other series of big taxes that we could use in different ways. When all the eggs are in the income tax basket, it's almost a foolish argument to actually have. I do think, though, one thing which I know is not universally popular, but I do think that it is worth examination. In 1999, when the Parliament started, we spent, I think I'm right in saying, 43% of GDP on public spending. GERS last month showed that we're now spending 52. If you take North Sea Oil out, we're spending 55% of GDP. So we've gone up over 10% of GDP. Now, just for context, other than in Finland, I know we talk a lot about Scandinavia, rightly so. Other than Finland, which is in the mid-50s, Norway, Denmark, Sweden all spend 46, 47% of GDP. So does New Zealand. Ireland spend less than 30, right? We are already spending a massive proportion of our national income on public services. Now, that would be fine if it worked, but it hasn't. Because if you look at key public services They are not getting better. They're not getting better. Education is a hidden disaster. I've got 4 kids in state school. It is devastating what's going on in schools. Our health service, not any worse than the NHS in England, but if you compare our health service to European services, it is not good. It is very poor at delivering what it's supposed to do. We have fewer doctors per head, fewer nurses per head, fewer beds per head, fewer MRI scanners, CT scanners. Our outcomes in heart attack, stroke, cancer are worse than all comparable European countries, despite the fact that we spend a pretty average amount of money per head with them all. We've got massive structural problems here, and I don't think we talk about them in anything like as frank a way as we should.
Okay, let's go to the table at the very back. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we've had the 2026 elections. Your party is part of forming the next government here in Scotland. We've heard from Heather what the reality is on the ground for people, right? We've heard about the need for there to be greater investment in public services to address some of the issues. You have the 5 priorities within our manifesto, and your leaders. So don't give me any of this building consensus stuff, right? You're there to lead and to take unpopular decisions as well.
Here, here.
So what would you do in terms of ensuring we have tax justice to build social justice here in Scotland?
Ivan.
Thank you. Thought you'd come to me first. So I think the point that Andy makes is really important. The amount of money we put in, yes, that's important, but at least and probably more important is how we use that money. And I want to come back on that because that's got a direct relation to what we heard earlier on about what happens in the front line. Okay, too much of the money gets stuck in the system as it funnels its way through, and I see that in community groups in my constituency who are struggling to get not a lot of money to keep services running, who are having to fill in those forms all the time to get applications for grants, who have got reporting requirements on them, to which soaks up a huge amount of time, often very different reporting system for different bits of government, giving them different bits of funding on a short-term basis. So you're absolutely right, there is a whole issue there about how that process is structured. The public service reform agenda we're taking forward is directly focused on that, to make that more streamlined, more simplified, more effective, so that money does get, more of it gets directly to the front line. The target we've got is to take over the next 5 years £1 billion more from the support functions to make sure it gets to exactly where it's needed on the front line, and a huge amount of work happening on the health side of things, and I recognise what you're saying, Andy. We need to be doing better there in terms of the money that does go into the 22 billion that goes into the health service to make sure that that's delivering on those frontline services, and some of that is about how we structure it, some of it how the money flows, some of it's how we focus on prevention, where we've had some good results, but there's an awful lot more to do. In terms of the 5 asks, and I had a look at that earlier, there's quite a lot of that is in the reserve space. So the reality on wealth tax is that we're not really able to take anything forward now other than what we talked about earlier on council tax. The reality on, and I've explored this when I was the business minister, the extent to which we can use, for example, NDR to leverage changes in fair work practices with businesses is very, very limited, because we don't have any devolved power over employment law. So anything that we go into that space, you need to be not pretending it's employment law when it blatantly is, because otherwise it's open to legal challenge and you can't execute on that. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about that we'd like to do, unfortunately, you can't take it forward because of the reserve restrictions on that. But we talked earlier, we'd love to have more power over that. Where we have made a change, if we talk about income tax, 1.7 billion more we're already raising through the changes we made on income tax policy that we are putting into public services. So would we like to do more on that? Yes, we would, but so many of those levers, as I say, we don't have control over.
And Ivan, just on the issue of the wealth tax, because you raised it there and you're quite right,
Sure.
This is completely reserved to Westminster. As a matter of principle, does the SNP support a wealth tax?
I think there's absolute value in it. I think you look at countries that have done it. I mean, Norway still has a wealth tax. on assets. I think there's absolute value in it. And we've got some work at the moment on investigating what's happening globally, what best practice examples of that, how you would execute on that, because all these things, you get into the detail, say wealth tax, what does that mean? Liquid assets, illiquid assets, assets you've got internationally, assets you've got in country, property, shares, businesses, etc., etc. So you need to understand exactly what it is you're talking about, but I think in principle, we absolutely think there's value in that. We've called on the UK government to take further steps in that, or to give us powers to do that. And as I say, we're looking at the moment doing some work, even though we don't have the powers on it, to look at international best practice to understand what a system like that would look like.
It does raise this point again. I mean, you're sympathetic to a tax change over which you have no power for.
But we'd like to have the power for it.
You'd like to have the power for it, but you support it because you won't have to implement it because it's for Westminster, and the power that you do have something over with council tax, you can't commit to scrapping.
Well, again, I'll throw it back to you. If we're going to scrap council tax, what would you replace it with? Because you ask 10 people what they would replace it with, you'll get 10 different answers.
Well, your policy used to, for many years, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was a local income tax.
Yeah,
and in fact, the 2007 manifesto said, we will scrap the unfair council tax, and you were looking at a local income tax.
I'm not going to answer for the 2007 manifesto, but the reality is a local income tax for various reasons wouldn't be effective. And I don't even know if you'd ask in here if people thought that would be the right answer. If you're talking about property-based tax, I said earlier, you need to decide, is it going to be revenue neutral? Because there'll be a lot of people here that will be thinking it's going to bring a lot more money to public services. But if you say it's revenue neutral, there's as many winners as losers. Is it going to be set locally, which was one of the asks? If you set it locally, then that means that the tax in the expensive areas you're talking about isn't going to be as marked a difference, because you're going to keep the same amount of revenue coming into each local authority. What about the relief system, which again takes a huge number of people that are in that poverty challenge out of the council tax system altogether? So there's a whole bunch of questions there. It's easy to say get rid of it. You need to be very clear about what you want to replace it with and why.
Well, we've heard what the manifesto commitments are for Tax Justice Scotland. Mark, notwithstanding what Ivan said about reserved matters, with the ones that are not reserved, can Scottish Labour sign up to them?
Yeah, I mean, I said earlier, we're absolutely committed to reform of the council tax. And when I say we need a consensus for that, I'm not talking about a 100% consensus in a parliament, but I do think we need to acknowledge the political arithmetic of what the next parliament will look like, and a simple majority in parliament would be enough for reform of council tax for me. You're not talking about entire consensus. It just has to have enough votes to get through the parliament, and I think that's been the real frustration over the last 20 years, is that the SNP have clearly had enough votes to get reform through a parliament.
You didn't vote for my revaluation proposals either, Mark. Like, it's not just on them.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a bit unfair to talk about that without the context. We were talking about a housing bill, we were talking about rent controls. I thought it was a Trojan horse to introduce council tax policy into a housing bill. I did say I would support it in principle, and if you brought it forward as a private member's bill, you'd have my name as a signature on your bill. So I think the wider context of how you decided to introduce that, I think, was a bit problematic, and it needed a wider discussion. I said that, but committed to reform of council tax, committed to reform of non-domestic rates, committed to the reforms that we've already agreed with. Ross and I have agreed on council tax on empty homes, second homes. I also think we should look at the exemptions on holiday homes for council tax too. But we're talking about some of the reserved powers as well. Now, the Scottish Parliament has received a funding increase because of changes that have been made at a UK Parliament level. UK Government increased national insurance contribution for employers. The Scottish Government took that funding increase as a result of that, but absolutely panned the tax increase. It was completely hypocritical for the government to take the money, spend it, but criticise the source of the funding. I think that's probably the same direction that the Scottish Government will take if we see any meaningful tax reform in the UK budget. But I come back to my earlier point, that tax justice, tax change just won't be possible unless the public can see where that money is going to go to improve their services. The Scottish Government got over £5 billion of extra money in their budget this year, and if you ask someone in the street where that's been spent, they will have no idea. Services haven't improved as a result of that money, And that's a big issue for us, that public confidence in how the Scottish Government have spent their money is so poor that any changes to tax will be treated sceptically.
Okay, Ross, you're making some progress because you've just had it there from the mouth of a Labour frontbencher that if you bring forward your proposal to revalue bands in terms of the council tax bands, he'll support it. There we are. We've got progress.
Yeah.
It's on the official report.
It is on the official report, yeah. I do feel like Sisyphus pushing the rock up a hill on this one, but and having been critical of the SNP and Labour, to give them credit, I even mentioned it, the reforms to income tax raised £1.7 billion more. The SNP broke a manifesto commitment to not do that because the Greens put it forward in budget negotiations and they agreed because that was our price for supporting the budget. Our public services are now £1.7 billion better off a year to do that. That was brave, credit to them for agreeing to do it. The SNP and Labour have both just agreed to another Green amendment that has been passed that lifts the cap on council tax for second and empty homes, like Mark was saying. So at the moment, councils can charge 200%, which we delivered a couple of years ago, but as of probably next year or the year after, they'll be able to go as far as they want on that. In Wales, it's 300%. That is both about raising revenue for local services. It's also a behaviour change mechanism. So there are 15,000 homeless children in Scotland. There's 22,000 second and holiday homes and about 46,000 empty homes. Like, we have an entirely solvable housing crisis, but we have a huge number of properties hoarded in the hands of a small number of people. So there are areas that we're making progress on this. To go back to the question though, so that you don't feel like I'm doing the politician thing of avoiding it, we want to see council tax and preferably non-domestic rates replaced with a combination of a residential property tax and a land value tax. I recognise that that is ambitious given the wider political challenges that we've got. That is what we're going to push for. But there are steps short of that that would make a transformational impact. So one of the areas the Greens are pushing on at the moment is to reform the debt rules around council tax. So in Scotland, you're chased for, it should be 20 years for any council tax debts. In practice, it's in perpetuity because the clock resets every single time you engage with the council. So you end up accumulating a huge amount of debt. So many people who are in poverty in Scotland are in debt to the state, and it's unpayable, toxic debt. So what we want to see is a change to that. In England, it's a 6-year, not 20-year. In Scotland, most other forms of public sector debt are 5 years. So there are steps we can take, even within the system that's broken right now, that would provide a huge amount of relief for the most vulnerable people in our society. So yeah, big lofty goal, replace the council tax and preferably non-domestic rates with residential property and land value taxation. But there's tweaks, changes we could make right now that for the most desperately vulnerable people, for the kind of people Heather talked about, would be genuinely transformational. And there is nothing stopping us from making those kind of changes now. They certainly don't need consensus.
We're into this at the last 15 minutes. I'm going to try and get around as many tables as I can and maybe take 2 or 3 questions and put them. Yeah.
So Heather, when she was talking, asked politicians to have the courage to actually use the powers that they have to change the situation. And the question that we had on the table is recognising where we are in Scotland within a devolved settlement where certain things being reserved and also the powers that you have. What, as politicians, will you do to make sure that politicians across the UK got on board with the public who are behind a wealth tax, who want to see reform the council tax, who know that, who actually accept and know that we need to pay taxes to get better public services, to be able to deal with the key issues that are affecting society? What will you do? Bernard gave an example earlier around how reform to the council tax was ditched because of poor headlines in the Glasgow Herald. Ross has just given an example around how Rutherglen and the campaigning of political parties has impacted on a change that was proposed. So what, as politicians, are you going to do to stand up, to use your courage and show leadership that actually allows us to have those honest and transformative conversations that need to take place on this?
Okay, and let's go to another table. I think Tommy Shepherd.
I just want to press on this question of council tax reform, because I agree that consensus across the Parliament would be a very good thing. Not everybody, but at least 60 or 70%, because without it, it would be unsustainable into future parliaments, and also you wouldn't have the adequate consent amongst the paying public for any new change. So that's good. So my question is, what will you do to achieve that consent? And will you work with other parties to try and achieve a consensus, even if it means you have to compromise your own policy? And secondly, given everybody knows that a revaluation will be required no matter what the council tax is replaced with, would you commit to beginning that process of revaluation separate and in parallel with any legislative discussion that goes through the Parliament?
And thirdly, down here.
Our table's question follows on very closely to that, and it builds on this point about political consensus. So that can come from political parties, it needs to, but it can also come from civil society. And our question is, will, in particular looking at SNP, Labour and Green representatives, commit to meeting with Tax Justice Scotland representatives over the coming months to discuss how to take forward local tax reform with those principles around the revaluation at the centre?
Andy, I want to come to you first on this, the first point that was made, which is about getting behind the wealth tax was given as an example, but I suppose what it was about changing the narrative about tax. How can we expect politicians to be arguing for some of this if they do not seek to change the narrative? Now, you're a political analyst and commentator, so you're best placed, in a sense, to explain this. I mean, why is Labour in London shy about a wealth tax? Because I think we all agree there is zero chance that the Chancellor is going to embrace a wealth tax in the budget on the 26th of November. So how do people who want to see change to tax change it in a practical sense when politicians are always looking about how this will affect the political wind?
So there's a few parts to this, I think. Incidentally, I don't think there's a zero chance that Rachel Reeves will do that. I think it's a low chance, and it's lower than it was because they've looked into it and they don't like the look of it, I think, is the truth. And that, I suppose, is part of the context here, is that if you put out an opinion poll saying, do you support taxing the rich more, yes or no? You're going to get overwhelmingly yes. That's how opinion polling works. That's always going to happen. But YouGov do a tracker every month, have done for 6 or 7 years. And the questions in that tracker are, do you think tax and spending are too high? Do you think tax and spending are too low? And then don't know and neither. Now, right through to about 2023, more people thought tax was too low and spending was too low than the opposite. Now that's completely changed. Since about 2023, it's completely changed. Now, there's twice the number of people now, according to this monthly tracker poll, who think tax is too high and spending is too high than think that tax is too low and spending is too low. And I think that's important. I know that this will not get a huge amount of support in the room, but I think it's important to understand that there is a wider context here where a lot of people do think that tax is already too high, has already gone far enough. They don't want to be taxed anymore. Partly because I think they look at the services they receive and say, what am I getting for this? This doesn't look good to me. Now, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, before the last rise in the upper rate, and I think that I'm right in saying the Scottish Government has effectively backed this position, is that it can't really go much higher before behavioural change actually makes it return nothing at all. So, yes, it's important to... It's understandable that we want to be able to sit here and look for simplistic answers. The reality is they don't always exist. And we've seen this from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I think we've seen it from the Scottish Government, that there's only so much you can do before you start having a perverse impact on the amount of money you actually bring in. Now, if you look at how much, let's just talk UK-wide. If you look at what this country spends on various different things, you're now looking at about a third of all expenditure is on welfare, and then about another quarter's on health. So over half of the pie is now health and welfare. There is only, and on current trends, that just goes up and up and up and up and up. There's 5,000 people every day in the UK who go on to, working age people who go on to out-of-work benefits. It's not sustainable. It can't possibly continue. If you keep spending that amount of money on welfare and health, there's nothing left to spend on anything else. And it doesn't matter how much you rinse rich people, there's just not going to be enough to go around. So governmental decision-making is much more complex than looking at one thing in isolation and saying, look, see if we just raise that wealth tax, all the boxes are then ticked and everything is answered. It's just not, I don't think it's realistic. And the absolute reality is, again, I know that not everybody will support this, but the reality is, unless we look really carefully at what has become a peculiarly British, not Scottish, but a peculiarly British issue, where working age people increasingly don't work, which doesn't happen on the continent, but it is happening here every day. unless we dive into that, that's a real problem. And it's not just an economic problem, it's a massive social problem. It's intergenerational poverty, intergenerational worklessness, and there's nothing that will impact people's mental health, physical health and poverty more than more and more and more of them not working.
Okay.
And that's the complexity of this.
I think there's a report in the Times today that 1 in 10 people in Scotland of working age have never worked. For the three politicians, I suspect that you're going to get the answer that you want to hear. Will you meet with Tax Justice Scotland, your party, before the election and engage with them? That's the first one. And Tommy Shepherd's point, which is really that taking forward this issue of consensus and council tax reform, can we take it that the reform will be some property-based tax rather than a local income tax? And secondly, given that there would have to be a revaluation now, should there be a consensus now that a revaluation needs to take place? Ivan.
So to answer the questions, yes to the meeting. I'll be amazed if we haven't met already, but we haven't. We'll do it, and we'll certainly do it again. So I've absolutely no problem that the more voices we've got in this space talking about policy, the better. In terms of the wealth tax, and I think that we've worked really hard to change that narrative. We get criticised most of the time for those differential tax rates, for people saying that we tax too much, for diversion from UK policy on tax, etc., etc. We're very upfront in our tax strategy and everything we talk about, that those with the broadest shoulders should pay the most. Where we've taken forward that income tax, and that number again, 1.7 billion. I mean, I looked at, from memory, the number in the Tax Justice Scotland papers was 490 million. I don't know if that's the whole picture of wealth tax, but certainly the wealth tax was 490 million. We're already raising 1.7 billion through the tax changes we've made to tax the wealthiest more. So we've already done nearly four times that through what we've implemented already. So we're absolutely serious in taking that agenda forward. And in terms of pressure on the UK government on that, yeah, of course we are. And as I said earlier, our position on the wealth tax supports that. A few things that Andy mentioned, that inactivity number, people kind of think, oh, it's a huge number. That includes students, it includes folks stay at home, parents bringing up young children, it includes early retirees, it includes a lot of people, frankly, that had a business during COVID and sold it up and didn't start again. Yeah, but the activity number does. And then that number includes students. So there's a lot of students haven't worked. Well, no surprise, because they've gone straight from school to university or college. So you've got to be a wee bit careful with those numbers. But I do take the point, there is a big focus to address that number, particularly the ill health component of it, which I think is about a third or a quarter of it. Just a word of warning on some of the points that Andy made as well in terms of tax take. When we put up the last increase on the additional rate of 48 pence, in theory that brings you in £32 million. When you factor in the behavioural impact, it only brings you in £8 million. £8 million. But in the context of a £20 billion income tax receipt or a £65 billion public sector spend in Scotland, it's not a lot of money, right? So you've got to get it. There is diminishing returns the higher you push this for lots and lots of reasons. And finally, on the council tax, we've been engaged very extensively with COSLA. We meet with them very regularly and others in that space to work out how we take this forward. There is a consultation getting put together jointly with Scottish Government and COSLA that will be launched soon that will cover all those aspects, and that's going to be the basis of that consensus we're seeking to build.
Mark.
It's easy for me to commit to a meeting because, as Bernard said earlier, I'm a last-minute substitution for Martin Whitfield, so I'll absolutely commit. Probably Michael Mara as our finance and tax spokesperson. Michael Mara will definitely meet you, so it's easy for me to make that commitment. I think we're right in what we're talking about. Reducing inactivity in the workplace is absolutely crucial, but I think you need to look at why there's so much inactivity level. It's because pay is so crap, pay is so low. When I was speaking to PCS recently, they were talking about 40% of the staff who work for the Department of Work and Pensions being on universal credit. And you're thinking 40% of the people who process the benefit systems are relying on it. The low pay is such a huge issue, and that's why I was really proud to see the reforms coming through at a UK level on increasing minimum wage and workers' rights, and I think that's a much more fundamental issue that to tackle low pay as a way of tackling inactivity and then boosting the ability to increase the median wage, increase the average wage in Scotland to get people out of poverty, but also to increase the tax base and give us more money to spend on public services, because that's the tipping point for me. I've said it over and over, that the tipping point is actually persuading the public that progressive taxation is right. It's where they see less waste in government spending and services improving when they look out the front door, when they see the state of the roads or the bins or the parks, when you're dropping your kid off at the school gates. I'm taking 3 of mine this morning before I came through here, and you can see the impact on waste, and people are saying, well, if I'm paying more, is it just going to go in the big government bonfire? So you need to win that argument as well. On council tax and consensus, absolutely. I think when I'm talking about consensus, it's clear that there is no party is going to go into the Parliament after the next election and have the ability or authority to implement wholesale their proposals. It will need to involve give and take amongst the parties that are committing to reform of council tax. We are absolutely one of them.
Just before I give Ross the last word, Ivan wanted to come back on a point that was raised, but perhaps I'll just shoot in another quick question, because we heard from Laurie McFarlane this morning about the fiscal challenges that face Scotland going forward based upon some projections from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Now, you are presiding over public service reform to make sure that you get value for money for absolutely every pound that goes into our public services. We know where you attempt to go in terms of efficiency savings in the next few years. Is the way forward, in a sense, not only a debate about where fair taxation comes, but that frankly in the devolved era, all governments have been slightly negligent in asking themselves the question, are we wasting too much money?
So, first of all, the point I was going to come back on was on the minimum wage. If we had devolution of employment law, we could set our own minimum wage in Scotland, which we would love to be able to do. But Labour government in the UK has absolutely resisted that, which I think is a mistake and unfortunate. But in terms of the point you make, yeah, I mean, we've been on that journey. If you look back at some of the reforms that have taken place, the police and fire reforms, everybody agrees with them, but that's saved, I think, totally about £2 billion in total in back office costs over those years because they're a more efficient service. And you go right through, there's a whole series of things we have done, but absolutely we recognise there's more to be done. It's a big system delivering a lot of services with a lot of money and a lot of people in it. 500,000 people work in the public sector in Scotland. So yeah, there will always be challenges. You can always make it more efficient, and that is a journey that we're absolutely focused on now because, frankly, we don't have any choice.
Ross, there's a minute to go, so if you could do it in a minute, I'd be grateful.
People complain about how quick I speak at the best of times. On the point of working age people working and therefore contributing to the tax system, Mark's right about low wages. Most children in poverty in Scotland are in working households, so work is not a route out of poverty. For a start, we're asking people to take on crap low-wage jobs that will make them and their family worse off because suddenly they're not around to care for their children anymore, so they've got childcare costs on top of that. So one of the things we need to do is expand childcare. That costs money. That takes you straight back to the wealth redistribution point here as well. I do agree with Ivan on the need for significant public service reform. I want a bigger state. I don't think the state does enough, but the state we've got is not the one that I want. Why do we have 2 different commissioners on ethical standards in Scotland? There's loads of just little examples like that, but they do add up. The Greens already meet with Tax Justice Scotland. We'll continue meeting, that's absolutely fine. I wanted to just touch on Tommy's point around council tax and compromise, because I think that is really important. I mentioned earlier on, we've got our ideal position, you replace the council tax and NDR with land value tax, residential property tax. We will not let the perfect be the enemy of the good on this one. If we can find a position that everybody can coalesce around that improves the system dramatically, makes it fairer, if it's not exactly what we want, it's still a big improvement. There's other aspects of this that we've not touched on though. Laurie mentioned some of it earlier on, of just the sheer amount of land and property in Scotland that's not even on the valuation roll. Why do salmon farms pay no tax? They're not even on the valuation roll and they're owned by massive multinational corporations, but they don't have to go on the valuation roll. In fact, it's in law that they're not on the valuation roll. So there's all sorts of elements of our tax system that they're not broken, they are rigged in favour of very wealthy individuals and corporations. So yes, We need to replace the council tax, we need to make dramatic changes there, but there's a whole range of other areas of our tax system that without fundamental change, you don't even need to scrap and replace systems. Look at the ones that we've got, look at the exemptions, look at the loopholes, look at the relief systems. They're not good value for money. There's so much more we could do with what we've got that wouldn't even require a change in the law.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. Can we get a round of applause for our panel?